Thanks for joining me for this episode from the EmbellishPod. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on one, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com and I'll get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at EmbellishPod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's also a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today, I have Kevin Aslan joining me from Hotaling, which is also Old Potrero, which is also Junipero Gin, which is also Hirsch Whiskey. So we have a great conversation about a whole bunch of different stuff. And as usual, I got maybe a third of my questions answered that I wanted to ask. So I hope you guys enjoy today's episode.
You never know.
Yeah. I know what my day-to-day language looks like, and so that's what it's going to have to be. You know, I'll throw some out there as well. So, all right. Oh, and then I didn't even mention this. So I've got it set for an hour. I can't go beyond that, but if you need a shorter amount of time, let me know and we'll be done.
That's all good. I'm ready.
Okay, perfect.
This isn't live, right? You're just recording.
No. It's just recording, and if you don't want video up, you tell me, and I won't put the video up. But I usually do both. I do audio and video.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Easy.
Perfect. All right. This morning or afternoon, whenever you happen to be consuming this, I have Kevin Aslan from Hirsch and a couple of other places, including Hotaling. I don't know. Hotaling. It's over your shoulder there, and I'm reading it and trying to make sure that I say it right. Kevin, thanks for hopping on for a discussion. You and I met through another podcast a little bit over a year ago. And I knew at that point I wanted to make sure I made some time to have you hop on and talk about the different things that you work on. But you specifically didn't start off in the whiskey industry. You started off as a filmmaker who transitioned into beer and then became whiskey. Like, how does that life happen? How do you get from that start to where you are now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, no one's ever kind of asked me that. I mean, look, I was going to school to study film. I was always really interested in it in high school and before that. Like, I always had a camera with me. I was that kid. And then I went to school for it. And right after I was done with college, I started working at a market research company. And I was trying to figure out like how to get into the film industry and didn't really know where to look. But at the same time, my roommate was working at Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco. And I was kind of venting to him one day about this market research job I had, and he just said, "Hey, he's like, they're hiring at the brewery, and like they don't do that often. So if you want to like come, like I could probably get you a job." So went with him the next day to the brewery, got a job there working on the bottling line. So like I never actually worked in the film industry. Like I didn't intend to have a career in spirits, but it just kind of took over.
So I guess what was the, because there's some degree of artistry that goes into beer brewing and distilling for that matter. You start out on a bottling line, and to kind of make the transition to here, a whole lot of people just don't, that like bottling line, packaging, whatever, the manufacturing side, they sort of stick there and they move to another manufacturing function. I guess what about it grabbed you that said, "Hey, I want to pursue this to the next level, the next level, and the next level"?
So I really fell in love with Anchor Brewing Company. The people there, a lot of them had been there for 20, 30 years. I liked that it was a San Francisco, American company making a product, that you could hold. It's very rare in San Francisco to have like a physical product. There's a lot of tech companies here, so I just really fell in love with the brewery and the process of making beer, and I really believed in just trying to make artisanal beer and spirits. And I always liked making things. So when I started getting into the brewing and distilling process, something just kind of clicked where I kind of, all my creative energy went towards specifically spirits. And throughout the years, the company has kind of just like let me run with certain things. Mm-hmm. And it just really, to be honest, like I just completely dropped anything creative except for spirits. It just became my focus.
Hmm. Well, and I think to say you dropped everything creative, like spirits brewing and distilling both have like I think an equal mixture of art and science, right? And that's what kind of brings the idea of alchemy to it. Is it's not just straight science, it's not just straight art, it's some weird place in the middle, and it's a place that you find people that work in tech end up falling into it, and people that work in art end up falling into it. You can, I could name off a couple of different brands or companies that started. Former tech guy becomes a whiskey person, or former, world renowned photographer becomes a whiskey guy, right? Like that transition happens the same way, and so it's still a very creative process. Um,
True.
transitioning from brewing to distilling, you're just moving to the next step after, to make whiskey, you make beer first and then you distill it. Um, was that something that Anchor Brewing was doing when you joined them, or is that something that kind of picked up along the way?
So the distillery was very small at the time. Before I was in the distillery, like when I was still on the bottling line at Anchor, there was only two people working in the distillery. So all they did every day was, make their own mash for Old Potrero, and they would do gin distillations at the same time. So they were completely separate from the brewery, meaning the brewers at Anchor were not making the distillers beer for Old Potrero. The only thing we shared like certain equipment, obviously, but we did use the Liberty Ale yeast for Old Potrero.
Mm-hmm.
Gives it a very distinct, ale yeast is a different flavor that your spirit will end up with. So that's like kind of where it was hugely beneficial though, because they maintained the yeast, and we didn't really have to worry about it from like a lab stance.
Mm-hmm.
They, Anchor Brewing had its own lab and its own team, so we would just kind of, take the yeast as we needed it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a really good relationship.
And so Old Potrero, rye, obviously rye. You said that already, but was there ever an attempt to bottle up the beer portion of it and have a side by side? Here's the beer version of it, and then here's the actual whiskey portion of it.
We talked about it sometimes, like distilling steam beer or maybe distilling, something, but it didn't ever, it never lined up. Like it just never happened, except for we started distilling some Christmas ale, because Anchor Brewing every year would do, our special ale, which is the Christmas ale. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah.
So like every year, the brewery would always have some beer left over, and instead of just dumping it, we started to distill it, and we distilled it the same way we distilled, whiskey, double pot distilled, and we actually released a few versions of it unaged. It was called initially it was called White Christmas, and we released that under Anchor, the Anchor Distilling label.
Mm-hmm.
And then the following 2 years, we released it under, it was just called Christmas Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
There was like some legal reasons why we had to change the name, but that's the only time we ever distilled and released an Anchor brewing product.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about Old Potrero, right? So this is you started on the beer arm, but you end up working in the distilled arm of Anchor Brewing, making what is a pretty storied brand.
Yeah, I mean, geez, where should I start? Old Potrero was really the first pot distilled rye whiskey in America since Prohibition. It really started the whole craft whiskey kind of movement. There were a few distilleries doing, brandy, like eau de vie type spirits. But in the 90s, Fritz Maytag, he had done the beer thing and he was looking to do what was next. So he secretly started the distillery and started with whiskey. And he knew he wanted to do rye whiskey because that was really America's first whiskey, right?
Hmm.
I mean, we're known for bourbon, but it really started with rye. So that really interested Fritz, and the fact that there was not 100% malted rye whiskey on the market, he decided to dive into it, and that's really where the brand started. And they really focused on the quality and the process, getting the copper pot stills made. Back then, it was sort of not easy to find someone that would make, a 250-liter copper pot still.
Hmm.
So he spared no expense and just wanted to do it right. Spent years developing the spirit, and finally, in 1996, um, they released the first bottling of Old Potrero Rye Whiskey.
And you said it was kind of hard to find a pot still. I mean, to put the context around it, between what the '60s and the early 2000s ish, 2010s ish, uh, everybody was running column because it was supposed to be a clear spirit, right? You just needed a
Right.
clear spirit because it was going to be cocktails, or it was going to be mixed into something, or it was going to become gas or whatever. Nobody was doing craft largely, and craft is sort of where pot stills reign supreme. Um, you know, what what about? I guess was there anything about the fact that you were distilling a rye whiskey? You're exactly right. It is the first distilled spirit of the United States. I often joke, that was the first spirit of Kentucky when Kentucky was still Virginia, right? Because at one point it was one big state, right? And
Right.
rye was being distilled really, really heavily. But Kentucky people don't like that. I live in Kentucky. We're bourbon. Bourbon is the answer. Um, is there something attractive about it being rye that you want to work with, or just like the whole process of distillation itself was the interesting part?
So yeah, for me, I think rye is very interesting, and it's funny because before I got into distilling, I wasn't really into whiskey as much. I was really into beer. Like 2010, 2011. That's like when beer was really taken off again, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you remember those days. But when I started to get into whiskey, like I started with rye, and like it's kind of ironic because my mom's drink was a rye old fashioned.
Hmm.
Like that's what she would get like occasionally when we'd go out. So like I've always kind of known what rye whiskey was,
Hmm.
and the fact of like that, I don't know, I kind of ended up working with it is sort of strange. But I think it's very appealing because I still feel like it's an underrepresented spirit, rye. And I mean, I know it's growing, and I love seeing it.
Hmm.
So many brands are putting out rye whiskeys, but I still feel like malted rye specifically is underrepresented, and especially pot distilled rye whiskeys. You just don't see them. And I could talk more about like pot distillation versus column, if you want to get into that eventually. But it's just a very unique, very rich, full uh, product when you do it. Both malted rye and pot distilled. It's different.
Hmm. Without a doubt. And there are a couple of other brands that are starting to catch up to the idea of doing 100% malted rye. And it was the first time I ever had Old Potrero. You read the label. I don't know what 100% malted rye even means, but then whenever I had rye later on, I just knew it was different, and I didn't really
Right.
know why, right? Because I didn't. Nobody was thinking. Well, I wasn't thinking that deeply about whiskey in the mid 2000, 2005, 2006, 2007. It was a beverage that was in front of me. I just noted that it was different, and I liked it better. The malted rye concept. So what do you think? I guess now you're in an educated position as an innovation distiller, which we'll come back to because I don't know what that means, and I want to know what an innovation distiller is. Um, but so, what specifically do you think makes the malted rye more interesting than just a traditional non-malted rye?
Yeah. So the malted rye to me just kind of rounds out the the malt itself. So unmalted rye is great, but when you malt it, like when it goes through that process, and then you distill it, it gives it sort of not only like that sort of kind of green, like hay, kind of grassy character, but it gives it this sort of um, like kind of like a roasted, almost like fruity, just more complete flavor is how I would sort of describe it. It just gives it like that certain richness that like I'm used to with malted ryes. When I have an unmalted rye, it's I don't think one is better than the other. I don't like to use that word, but they are very different. The unmalted just seems like a little bit more mellow and a little bit more maybe better for blending, for using in like a bourbon blend or a rye blend. But something about the malting just allows you to put out a whiskey that is 100% rye and not
Mhm.
really sort of worry about any other flavor. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just sort of, to me, it just makes sense to do 100% malted rye as opposed to doing, I mean, I don't think you really could do 100% unmalted rye. I'm sure you could somehow, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's hard to explain the difference unless you're tasting it.
Mhm.
But I would just say it's like a more complete version of rye.
I think the way my brain has always framed it up is it feels more full, right? You
Yes.
get maybe a muted version of a flavor, and it's sort of it's like the difference between a peach and a grilled peach, right? Is a grilled
Yeah,
peach, you still taste the original peachiness, but then there's this like fuller other flavor that comes out of cooking it that's a little bit different. And that's not that I'm saying it tastes like grilled peaches, but it's the same kind
sure,
of transition, at least for me, between a 95.5, which is, mostly non malted rye, and a 100% malted rye. Like it's a distinct difference for me. But
for
so
sure.
you're at Old Potrero. How does Hotaling come into this? Like how does this become a part of the conversation?
Yeah, so Hotaling, we used to be called the Anchor Distilling Company. So when Fritz started Old Potrero, he started another company entirely within Anchor Brewing. It was called Anchor Distilling Company. And, we were Anchor brewers and distillers up until 2017. So in 2017, Sapporo bought Anchor Brewing Company, and Anchor Distilling Company remained independent, and we spun out, is I guess is the right word, stayed independent, but we had to change our name. So we changed our name to Hotaling Co, which is the parent company for Junipero, Junipero Gin, Old Potrero Rye Whiskey, and Hirsch. We're also like an importer of spirits.
Mhm.
So we have like a bunch of other brands that we help bring to the United States and distribute.
Yeah, I think a bunch of other brands is a bit of a undersell there. It's a lot of brands. So when
Right.
you kind of hop over to the Hotaling website and you kind of dig through all the different brands, it's like it's a veritable like if you were able to stock your shelf with only those beverages, you would still have a really, really full shelf across the gambit of different spirits that it could exist.
Very
So
true. Yeah.
it's a big thing, but I am going to take one step backward. So your title right now is Innovation Distiller. I've seen head distillers, I've seen assistant distillers, I've seen distiller. What's an innovation distiller? What does that mean?
Uh, it's definitely made up in the terms of my managers were trying to think of like a good title for me because I do a lot of different things, right?
Mhm.
I do distillation, I do research and development distillations, do a lot of blending for Hirsch and Old Potrero. So they were trying to figure out like how do you put all that in one title, and innovation distiller was sort of the easiest way to encompass that title, just like internally, right? Like, hey, if like you're working on any new product or you have any questions, just ask Kevin. Like he's the guy to go to. So it's really kind of a mix of head distiller, head blender, but also research and development of products.
Yeah, and I think the title fits, right? Because usually, whenever I think of a head distiller or a distiller in general, they're making sort of the. I don't want to say this sounds a little bit, but it's like you're making the same thing. You kind of establish what you're going to do, but it sounds like what you're doing is that, and also making sure that you're exploring new ideas, trying out new things, which I think a lot of distillers do, but we as the nerds never really catch that part, right? Because it's, we're thinking about the traditional product that comes out. Now, you just touched on Hirsch. So how does Hirsch fit into this? So we've got Anchor Distilling, to Hotaling, Old Potrero is a part of it. You've got a gin, which we'll get to in a second, but how does Hirsch play in this game?
Hirsch has been a brand, that's been around since 1974. There's a lot of history behind the brand. There's actually a really good book called The Best Bourbon You'll Never Taste, and it's all about the man A.H. Hirsch and his legendary whiskey that he basically had made in the summer of 1974 at the Schaefferstown Distillery in Pennsylvania. And the brand really started by a few different bourbon retailers out there in Kentucky who started the brand Hirsch as a way to bring the whiskey that he had commissioned to market. Hirsch himself was never actually involved with the creation of the brand, but he himself was always trying to bring high quality whiskeys to market, through contract services. Basically, that's what he did. So fast forward to 1990, the Hirsch label put out the A.H. Hirsch 16-year reserve, which is, a legendary whiskey at this point. Those original bottles go for anywhere between, $5,000 and $30,000 a bottle now. So really high quality whiskey. Imagine having a 16-year-old bourbon in 1990. That must have been like drinking something from the future, is kind of what I tell people. And that was sort of the only whiskey that was released through Hirsch up until sort of the mid 2000s, when the previous owners of the Hirsch label were putting out, a few other American bourbons. They put out some Canadian rye whiskeys, but the brand sort of faded away. And in 2010, the group that owned Anchor Brewing Company, that bought it from Fritz Maytag, they basically bought Anchor Brewing Company, and then they bought this portfolio from Henry Price of Price Imports. I don't know if you know that name, but they basically merged these two companies into one. And one of the brands that Price Imports held was the Hirsch name. So basically, just through a series of business transactions, Anchor Brewing and Distilling all of a sudden were owned by the same people who owned Hirsch. And from there, I can go on if you does that make sense? I know that's a little,
keep going.
Yeah, I know it's a little much, but it's such a great story, and it's all true. But around 2010 to 2013, we sort of just let the brand fade away. And remember, I started at Anchor Distilling in 2011, so I always knew what Hirsch was. It was cool because we always had like those old bottles like at Anchor Brewing Company. Like we had a lot of them there that we like would not touch, but we just knew it was like this legendary thing. And being in the same building as Old Potrero was just really cool because like we had like 16, 17-year-old rye whiskeys from Old Potrero, and then we had this 16-year-old bourbon in the same building. It was just really, for me, it was sort of very humbling, I guess. But around 2013, our managers told Bruce Joseph, who's the master distiller for Old Potrero, and myself, hey, like we're going to relaunch Hirsch. Can you guys start to figure out what you think that should look like from a liquid standpoint? So we started going to Indiana and Kentucky to source whiskey in anticipation of relaunching Hirsch. And just to kind of make this easy, we didn't launch anything until 2020. So we really took a long time in sourcing and developing the liquid behind what would be Hirsch today.
So you're resurrecting a historical brand. It maybe not, historical in the way that some Kentucky brands are historical, but it has a significant reputation. Is that
Definitely.
daunting at the onset? Like, hey, we're gonna kick this up, but it also has it has it's known for a particular bourbon that was the best bourbon you'll never taste, right?
It was really daunting, and but like luckily for me, I was kind of used to that. Like working for Anchor Steam Beer was already a legendary brand. Old
Mhm.
Potrero was another one. So Hirsch, honestly, I think Hirsch was the best fit that you could find. Maybe not. I mean, it was just sort of meant to be. Like Hotaling is very artisanal in its thinking behind spirits, like who we import, what we make. It's all very high quality artisanal spirits. So it just seemed like the best fit. It was daunting, and to be honest with you, we had not done much blending back in 2013, 2014. Old Potrero, every drop of it, whether it was blended or you know a single barrel, it was all distilled in San Francisco. So every drop of it we were used to working with. Whereas Hirsch, all of a sudden we're blending other people's product, right? Like
Mhm.
through whether it was contracted or just buying the barrels already aged. It was a very new process. So that was very intimidating. But we really treated all of the Hirsch um, early blends just like Old Potrero. We just treated it with a lot of respect.
Mhm.
Took the time needed to make blends. We tasted for the first bottling of the Hirsch Horizon, which was the first uh, launch of the new label, the new look. Uh, we tasted over 100 different barrels from MGP out of Indiana for the first blend. Like it took us months to do because we just wanted to make sure everything that went into it met our standards. Um, so yeah, it was very intimidating, but I think we got really comfortable with it.
So you had to explore the idea of blending in a different way. Did you guys? How do you develop the flavor profile of Hirsch? Right, because you started Old Potrero and it has its flavor profile because it's been around for a while, but you're building a new one. Are you gauging it against those legacy bottles you had? Or are you just trying to? Like, how do you define that?
Yeah, we weren't really worried about the legacy of the 16 year because there's no way you're gonna replicate that, right? Um, it was definitely inspiring in terms of just high quality, legendary products. But this was our chance to sort of make Hirsch a modern brand. Bring it into the market now. Be very thoughtful about it. Be transparent with the sourcing. Um, so we started tasting a lot of different barrels from MGP initially for Horizon specifically, and eventually we found that they had a higher rye mash bill that they were offering us, and it was 36% rye, one of the mash bills.
Hmm.
So we got a bunch of those barrels and we started adding that into the original blend, and that really clicked for us because we came from rye whiskey, right, from Old Potrero.
Hmm.
So something about like that spiciness of rye with the the sweetness of the corn, because Horizon for the most part is a blend of two mash bills. One is higher in corn and one is higher in rye. So it just made sense to lean towards being a high rye bourbon for the first release of the relaunch.
And I'll say the Hirsch bottle itself is incredibly recognizable. They're beautiful. Um,
Yeah,
when you put it up against the other round bottles you have, I don't know if it's a marketing move or not, but you get more shelf space just by the bottle design itself, right? Because you have to allow for it. So, that's how you can expand your shelf space without having to, purchase it or whatever. But it seems like there's a lot more brand extension or line extensions with Hirsch than with Old Potrero. Is that is that where you're trying to explore your innovation is in the Hirsch line and keep Old Potrero sort of, almost like a sanctified ground of we keep it the same?
You got good questions. Yes, yeah. I mean, for now, yes. Hirsch is definitely more where we're putting a lot of our innovation energy. But I'll tell you, we're working on a lot of different innovations with both Old Potrero and Hirsch. But again, we've been sourcing for Hirsch since 2013.
Hmm.
So even though the brand only relaunched in 2020, we have about 10 years worth of product that we can pull from. And something about bourbon, I feel, uh, allows you to, like, the market is sort of ready to absorb new ideas. And
Hmm.
it wasn't intentional that we're like, hey, like, let's release a bunch of innovations with Hirsch. It's just sort of like, hey, this is really good. Let's release it. Like does this make sense? And it's really collaborative between production, operations, and marketing, where we basically want to put out stuff that's high quality, thoughtful, and yeah, innovative in a way too.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're spot on in identifying that bourbon is more accepting of innovation. And I look at it kind of under this lens. If I look back, and I think it was 2011 or 12, that's when Jim Beam was doing a lot of their signature craft explorations, and they were doing brown rice, and they were doing a handful of rolled oats and a bunch of different stuff that no one else was doing, and it didn't really splash in the market very well, but
Okay.
almost all of the things they were doing in 2011 are now starting in the 21, 22, 23. It's starting to become more widespread, whether it's barrel finishing or unique grains or whatever. Bourbon is ripe for that, whereas I think rye is still an infant market and it's not as accepting, but it also, you know, rye takes age different, takes finish different. It's a different creature in and of itself. But I think it'll be. I don't think its timeline to that kind of innovation is nearly as long as bourbon's was, because right now, I think the goal for rye should be to start harvesting bourbon drinkers that are tired of drinking bourbon flavored bourbon. And they want a new flavor, right? Especially the ones that are like, I like a high rye bourbon. Like, have you ever tried just a rye? Like, that would be a
Yeah.
good thing to do.
No, you're 100% right. And I'll tell you, oftentimes when I do, Hirsch related events like single barrel tastings or whatever, I'll often have an Old Potrero single barrel bottle with
Mm-hmm.
me, and like kind of at the end of the night I'll bring it out, and like seeing the look on like bourbon fans' faces when they taste 100% malted rye double pot distilled product, they're just like, wait, what? Like, what is this? Like, you know what I mean? It's just it's different. And I think you're right. I think people are slowly going to get into it more. But I will say about Old Potrero innovations, this year we've actually released two different products that we haven't done in a while. We released a 17-year-old version of our straight rye whiskey. We only
Mm-hmm.
did one barrel of it because it was literally forgotten about. And I know that sounds like made up, but like it was sort of a barrel we had set aside for blending. Sometimes, like when we would do the Old Potrero straight rye, we would add some older component into it to sort of even out the blend. But we stopped doing that, and that barrel was just sitting there, kind of aging, and it got to 17 years. So we're like, okay, like let's release this. It's a really interesting product.
Mm-hmm.
And then more recently, we released what we call our Old Potrero Hotaling whiskey. So it was a 16-year-old rye whiskey, but it was aged in a used bourbon barrel for 16 years, no new oak. And that's something we're going to do hopefully every year in April. And the reason we do it in April is it's in memorial of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that basically devastated the whole city. Just sort of a little history tie in there with the brand.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, and I believe I came across this, and there's a really interesting video about a interview about moving barrels during some fiery situations when they're trying to blow up a fire line to is like post earthquake. There's fires rampant in the city, and they're trying to put a fire line in place, and they're hiring people to roll barrels into an abandoned warehouse, whatever. I watched that entire thing and enjoyed. Those are the kind of stories that are super fun, and the nerds sort of geek out on. But I want to make sure that I heard this right. So you're intending to do a 16-year every year, or just the Hotaling Old Potrero?
The Hotaling's Old Potrero.
Okay.
So we at this point we've done a bunch of different releases of the
Mm-hmm.
Old Potrero Hotalings.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we took a pause for, I think it's been like 4 or 5 years where we sort of paused it. Um, so we've done everything from 11 to 18 years with the Hotaling. So the goal is sort of to release it in that range
Right.
when the whiskey feels like it's ready.
So it would be considered advanced age, right? In any realm of rye, right? Because a lot of folks are having their 4-year, 8-year rye, and that like 6-year, 8-year rye, people are like cheering on. But you're talking what would be considered advanced age. Are these like on-site purchases? Are these specific retailers get them? Because I can't imagine there's a ton of these that are available.
Yeah.
For the nerds that are looking for this, how do they find it?
It's definitely specialty retail,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sort of the accounts that have supported us for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we don't really we don't really like try to keep it. How do I say this? It's just a naturally scarce product,
Mm-hmm.
so we basically try to like identify who has been supporting this, the longest. Do they want it? Do they think they can sell it, right? We don't want them sitting on this inventory. So that's really up to marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really good at that, like figuring out who should get it and when they should get it, and then sort of rotating through all of the through our customers.
Mm-hmm.
But it definitely is. I want to say it's definitely more available in California. Um, I honestly don't know where else it's available. I'm sure it's probably some in New York and some in Texas, but I should find that out because like I don't know the answer to that question fully.
Yeah, so it becomes like a nationwide Easter egg hunt. Like if you want this, you just have to do the legwork yourself. And I would imagine you don't have to market it a ton because it probably sells itself relatively simply if it's in the right price market. Like if you put it in a rural area where the average income is $28,000 a year, it's probably not going to sell through real fast. But you put it in the
Yeah,
right markets with the right price point, and it'll get snatched up really really fast.
yeah,
I don't know of anybody else that's doing that aged of a rye. So it's it's an impressive thing to be out there. Um, Now you said you have some, you have 10 years worth of Hirsch product. Are you guys going to try to explore the idea of some advanced age Hirsch line bourbons as well?
definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're looking into that. It's just sort of, again, the whiskey kind of tells you what it's going to be, right? Like
Mhm.
it doesn't matter what you want to make. So we're waiting to see how the whiskey tastes as it gets older, but we're definitely thinking of that.
So and you also said that you guys do single barrels of Old Potrero. How
Yeah.
how common is that, right? Because I don't know that I've seen a ton of them on the marketplace. Not maybe just I'm not looking in the right places, but
So we started doing it. We really started doing it about 2 years ago.
Mhm.
Whereas before we would kind of do it just like maybe 5 barrels a year.
Mhm.
Just like if an account asked, we're like, yeah, like sure, like let's do a single barrel. Where we honestly didn't want to do single barrels for a long time because the original idea of Old Potrero was the historical aspect of rye whiskey, right?
Mhm.
So we really wanted it to be a 4.5. It was originally a 4.5 year whiskey, so
Mhm.
we wanted it to be that, right? Like a 4.5 year old whiskey, 100% rye. You could find it pretty easily, at the time, and not do too much innovation. It kind of ties into the question you were asking earlier. Um, but then as we saw people asking, and we realized we're tasting the single barrels all the time technically, and they're
Mhm.
phenomenal. So let's identify some really good single barrels and start to offer them. So we're definitely making it more of an option now if people want it. You know, with Hirsch, we have a pretty good
Hmm.
and regimented single barrel program where we release, you know, basically about 30 gold barrels a year, and then about 50 of our silver barrels a year. And then we actually have a white label single barrel for Hirsch that's always available, hopefully.
Hmm.
But with Old Potrero, it's definitely trying. We're looking into doing, you know, a consistent amount of single barrels every year, as long as the interest is there.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you're looking at Hirsch and you're doing, effectively 80 picks a year, that's still not a lot for the country, right? Like if you spread it out over the country, because you have a whole lot of brands that are doing, a couple of hundred picks a year, and they're from your perspective, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but from a producer's perspective, it's a lot more painful and a lot more expensive to put out a single barrel because you've got to stop everything, you've got to run things through a certain way. It's not the same as creating a blended batch of this many barrels that exist. But
Sure.
when you guys put aside barrels, or do you put aside barrels, or is just these are the next five in line and that's how you get to pick from it?
Oh no, we put him aside.
Mhm.
So again, Bruce Joseph, you know, he's the master distiller for Old Potrero, and I've been working with him since 2011, and him and I are really in sync with how we feel about, you know, spirits in general. I mean, we definitely differ from time to time, which, you know, is healthy. Um, but like it's like every week, Bruce will have tasted something and he'll be like, "Hey, like, can you taste these? Like, tell me what you think." So it's like, you know, 8 a.m. and I got 5 whiskeys on my desk I have to try, which is great. I'm not complaining, but there's always standouts, right? Like with any whiskey, you know, every barrel is going to be different, and it's really fun and interesting to see Old Potrero specifically, because I mean, most of that whiskey now, like I've distilled, right? Like I've been there for
Mhm.
so I've been here. I don't know why I said there. I've been here for so long now that it's like come full circle for me personally, and just like knowing like the little changes that we've done in production, you know, that like we don't really talk about because it's too pedantic, but
Mhm.
um, it's really, I mean, the brand is just really important to me, and I just feel like, you know, we really try to find the standouts and do it right.
Now, when you set barrels aside, do you look at it from a perspective of these exemplify? Because you don't always end up with the exact same flavor in each blend that Old Potrero does, but you're trying to kind of align to a brand standard. Your single barrels, are they these are that flavor but turned up to 11, or is it like this? This is you entirely unique but also good, right? Not in a bad way. Like this is a thing that is kind of out there, because I've been on a couple of picks, and usually that's the direction I go. Is like, okay, if I want just a really good version of the brand, I'll go buy the brand, right? This thing is like not what normally comes in this bottle, but it's made by these people, right? And that kind of gives you the idea of the variation that exists. But that was a long question. I'll stop now.
No, no, I love your questions, man. Like you think like a distiller, I'll tell you. Because like that, I mean, that's how we do it. Really, it's really just finding the standouts, and the effort that goes into that is really around tasting everything you make. And Old Potrero is a small enough brand where we are able to do that. So if something just if it's got like more stone fruit, or more like kind of like a dark stewed fruitiness to it, or if um, it's got like a more richness to it, more mouthfeel, more vanilla, whatever like the sort of outlier is, we'll definitely consider it for single barrel. Because, like you said, Old Potrero, like this the 6 year, it's definitely like it has its how do I say this? It has um, its flavor and its feel. So if anything stands out of that box, it's
Mhm.
sort of easy to be like, okay, like put that aside. Um, and you know, it's funny. Like I've never come across an Old Potrero barrel though that was like um, off.
Mhm.
if that makes sense. Like even at like 2 years, I'm like, this is like ready to go.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, that's 2 year rye is ready to go. And that's, because I think about, Peerless here in Kentucky, the first thing they put out was a 2 year rye, and they had a
I
line
love
around
that.
the building, and it was fantastic, right? Because at 2 years, it's not that it ages faster, just ages, it takes age differently. It takes wood differently. It takes finish differently. And it's spice components help compete with a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things to it. Rye is fascinating, and it's a thing that I haven't spent enough time with to feel really comfortable with. I'm from Kentucky, so I'm required to start with bourbon, and then we move our way to rye or single malts or things along that lines. And so in your job, you have to taste through Hirsch, you have to taste through Potrero, which are going to put you in rye and bourbon country. But then you have kind of this other facet, right, where you get a chance to taste gin, right? So you've got
Yeah.
Junipero, right? So tell me about Junipero.
Junipero is another first in terms of craft spirits. We've kind of moved away from that term craft in a way,
Mm-hmm.
but it was again it was the first pot distilled gin in the United States since Prohibition. So Junipero came after Old Potrero. Fritz felt like he had Old Potrero the production going well, and then he was really interested in gin just because he liked it. So he had Bruce Joseph start to work on that, and basically it took them 2 years to come up with the recipe that's known as Junipero today. And the first release was in 1996 for Junipero as well. Um, yeah, and that was it was just another first for the industry. It's a classic dry gin style. It's
Mm-hmm.
got 12 botanicals, nothing, no new American sort of botanicals like no cucumber, no lavender. It's just a very traditional, high proof London dry style gin.
So and my knowledge of gin incredibly limited. But what is the market fit for something like Junipero? Are you targeting, like, do people drink this gin, just drink this gin neat, or is it a cocktail gin, or like what's the purpose of it, I guess?
It was definitely designed for the martini specifically.
Mhm.
But at Hotaling Co, like I said, we import a bunch of different spirits, and a lot of those spirits are, known as like cocktail modifiers. So our Junipero, to me, is the most versatile gin out there. It works in any cocktail. I mean, it's high proof. It's got more juniper than any other gin, but like in a balanced way. Like it's not piney. It's more. There's different types of juniper berries, and the ones that we get are very. They're a little piney, but they're more persimmon like. So there's got a little bit of fruitiness to it, and it just sort of lends itself well to any cocktail. You can drink it straight if you want, if you're at that level, which is rare. Um, but it's definitely meant for cocktails. And again, like martini, Negroni, a gimlet, uh, a gin fizz, like really anything, it works well.
Yeah, it seems like if you build the spirit to target one of the keystone classic cocktails. Like, a martini is one of those keystone cocktails. Is, I don't know, there's like what, three cocktails that exist in the world, or four, or something like that, and everything else is a pivot off of that.
Right.
But martini being at that level, if it's going to fit a martini, then it would fit every derivative of it, which is going to be some gin cocktail. Makes a ton of sense. Um, so you mentioned the berries that you guys use are slightly different. Is this a thing that is sourced in California, or like where does this come from?
No, they're coming from different parts of Europe,
Okay.
and people ask us that a lot. Like, hey, like, is your gin local? And we wish it was, because it's a
Mhm.
really cool thing to have all of your botanicals sourced locally. But we just have found we're looking for quality overall.
Mhm.
So we have just found the best quality we think is coming from these different sources throughout the world. So like we didn't really want to limit ourselves like with Junipero, and we actually just released the first line extension ever of Junipero, and the thinking was the same, like let's do something that's just high quality, not so much um, locally focused.
Mm-hmm. Well, and juniper berries. This is going to be a weird comparison. Juniper berries are to you guys and to most of the United States are similar to rye in the state of Kentucky, right? You don't generically buy a lot of rye in the state of Kentucky because it doesn't grow well here. If you want good rye, you're getting it from somewhere else, right?
Sure.
And you can play the game of we want everything to be local, but if the local version of that thing is not good, then what are you going to do with the spirit that comes out the other end, right? So you
Right.
want a good quality ingredient, and if you can get it locally, it makes sense. You should do that. But if you
Right.
can't, you don't want to sacrifice the quality of the spirit that you're going to put out the other side.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know. I mean, we don't want to get too esoteric with our spirits. You know, we want people to be able to know how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, I think Junipero has done that really well. Like, you know, if you know it's from San Francisco and California, and like you're proud of that, like it works great. But like if you're in, you know, Kentucky or Texas and you pick up the bottle, like you'll be able to enjoy it and not have to worry about, like, you know, this doesn't taste like Texas. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
it's just
Yeah. Yeah. No,
it's
I follow what you're saying.
yeah, it's a great gin. And one so I mentioned earlier that we just released the first line extension, and this sort of ties into my innovation distiller role. Um, we've been wanting to do like a line extension for Junipero for a long time, and they basically kind of asked me like, hey, like can you come up with something for Junipero? And this was 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd been working with different teas for flavoring gin. Um, I mean, when you think about it, tea itself is botanicals, right? And
Yep.
gin is also botanicals. So there's a lot of crossover in terms of flavor and process. So we just released what we're calling Junipero smoked rosemary gin. So I wanted to tell you specifically about it because it's a smoked gin, which I don't I don't know of any other smoked gins on the market in the United
Mm-hmm.
States. I'm sure there's one out there, right? Like I feel like everything's been done, but this gin is it's got this sort of smoky quality to it where if you like mezcal or scotches, it definitely has that same sort of profile. Um, I should just send you a bottle because we just released it in April,
Mm-hmm.
but you'll hopefully start seeing it soon, and it's just been really exciting for us.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody else is doing a smoked gin, but I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase "Simpsons did it," right?
Yeah,
There's
of course.
yeah, so
Yeah,
that's where we are in the world with pretty much everything. So somebody may have done it doesn't mean they did it well, right?
right, right.
There's the possibility of it. You've got this gin that you're making, right? And you've got these other two whiskey brands. Are you guys thinking about exploring a barrel aged gin?
We've done them in the past, and the market gets really confused about it. It's really hard to do barrel aged gins for some reason. Maybe, you know, maybe in a few years. We're always messing with that at our distillery in San Francisco, but it's sort of the time isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
But I have an idea for something I want to do for a barrel aged gin, and I gotta bring it up to, you know, the powers that be here. But
Yeah.
hopefully in the next 5 years we'll do that.
Everybody's got a boss, and I asked that because that is something I have seen a little bit more of, and coming out of, and I'm going to use the word that you guys are moving away from, but coming out of craft distillers, I am
Right.
seeing more barrel aged gins kind of come into play now. We're pushing up on time, and I have one last
Of
question,
course. Of course.
but and this one's so you said you guys are avoiding the term craft. Is that because you want to move beyond that, or is it because there's a connotation attached to craft?
I mean, honestly, we just sort of, it kind of goes with what I was saying about locality and spirits. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like with craft, part of the benefit is saying you're local, and you can
Okay.
kind of lean into that as like a selling point. And while we definitely do that with California in San Francisco, we felt like the term craft didn't really fit us because since we are, you know, Hotaling Co, and we have
Mm-hmm.
national distribution, we have a national sales team. It just didn't really make sense for us to to use that term. Um, I mean, our products are definitely craft spirits for sure,
Yeah.
but like the industry, craft itself just became something else, over the last decade, and then we also became something else, and it just sort of happened where we moved away from it.
I really, I'm not trying to stroke your ego, but I really like that answer because there is a connotation that comes with craft, and I think that it's a bit of a misnomer, and I think everybody should be okay with it. But when you position it from the frame of you're not looking at it like most people who exhibit craft tendencies are, doing everything local, being very regional, grain to glass, whatever it is that's there, and not wanting to conflate your product to be a part of that market where it may be in some places and it may not be in other places. Makes a ton of sense. It's a great answer. I don't know if it's your answer, if it's marketing's answer, but whoever did it, bravo, good answer.
No, I mean, to be honest, I kind of just realized it as I was saying it. Like it wasn't ever
Mhm.
like an intentional thing. It just kind of happened.
Yeah.
No, but I'm glad you agree because like I mean I love craft beer, spirits, wine,
Yep.
but it just kind of went that way.
Yeah, it's because it's been an identifier that people like me that run podcasts or do all these other stupid esoteric things that are super nerdy. We will often wield the term craft like a negative connotation, and it's
Oh, really?
it's not fair. It's not correct. Yeah, because this is a tasting note that I'll hear. It tastes a little crafty, and that usually
Oh,
means it tastes young or it tastes malty or it tastes something. Right.
uh,
This is the thing that some of the whiskey nerds do, and I usually try to push back on that because I think it's rude as hell to begin with.
yeah.
Um, but you're also not being clear with communicating what it is that you got going on. So, um, Kevin, we're just about out of time. Is there
Sure.
anything else that you wanted to touch on that we didn't talk about?
No, I mean just keep your eye on Old Potrero and Hirsch
Mhm.
because we're going to be doing some really cool things in this year and the coming years. And again, just if you like uh, whiskeys with a lot of history and a lot of thought put behind it, I mean, like like with Hirsch, like they didn't need me to exist, right? They could have just slapped a label on the bottle, put
Right.
it out there, hope for the best. But we're really trying to do these brands right. So just keep your eye on them.
Yeah, there's giving respect to it. There's trying to sell off a name, and then there's giving respect to the name and making sure that it continues to grow in its notoriety. And I think that's been the case, because I know when Hirsch first reintroduced, I was out there pounding the pavement until Western Kentucky got a bottle that I was able to pick up off the shelf, right? Because we're we're in a very rural area, and so we're some of the last, even though we're in the state of Kentucky, and it may be a
Right.
bourbon that was launched in Bardstown, we may be one of the last markets to
Oh,
get it because there's
oh,
so few
geez.
people around me.
Okay.
So it was one that I sought out, and I was glad to have it. And Old Potrero, like I said, is it's been kind of a shelf standard for a lot of us for a lot of time. Um, Thank you for your time.
Of
Like I said
course.
before we were recording, it's the one thing you can never make more of. So I'm appreciative for your hopping on. And if there's anything that you guys are ever talking about, you need an outlet that's always available here because I
Awesome.
like what you guys are doing.
No, thank you, John. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to talk anytime. So hit me up.
Thanks for tuning into this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you have to be consuming this on and leave a comment if possible. Hit me up on social media on TikTok or Instagram using EmbellishPod. You can give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, and contact details. Thanks for stopping by.